Welcome back to Reason and Theology. We're talking today about do Frankists control the media? This is going to be a response to Candace Owens, who has been promoting this thesis as of late. And I'm going to be here joined by Joseph Cohen from Israel Advocacy Movement. He actually did a video thoroughly debunking Candace Owens very well in a video. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. It's called Candace Owens Just Destroyed Her Career. It was a really, really good video that touched on this topic and a few others and offered a very cogent rebuttal to Candace Owens. And I thought it was so helpful that I asked him to come on the show to talk about it with my audience. Joseph, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to have this conversation. The more people learn about this, the better.
Glad to do it, and I definitely wanted to get a Jewish perspective on the question that Candace Owens has raised. She's talked a lot about who controls the media, and right now she's couching it as a Frankist cult, and that might be new to some people. They might not be familiar with some of this stuff, and so if they watch that material and they hear her talking about all sorts of people that they have never heard of before and have never researched, I suspect it is something that could really be convincing to people because they don't know their left from their right on this topic. And so I'm really, really excited about this. So talk to us a little bit about Candace and her perspective on the Jewish people. What was her view in the past, and how does that contrast with what we've been seeing lately from her?
So, I mean, Candace is quite open about this, and she's got a huge archive of videos online, which anyone can watch. And she worked extensively with Jews, for Jews, both in media and outside of the digital space. And she was very friendly with the Jewish community. She had a Jewish partner. Like me, they had mezuzot, parchments of the Torah on their doorposts. So she's historically not at all anti-Semitic, very close to the Jewish community, very supportive of Israel and the Jewish community. And she was quite open. I think it was in 2023. She kind of described this betrayal that she felt when the Jewish community or members of the Jewish community objected to a comment she made in the UK in 2018. So I think she was, I can't remember the exact framing of the question, but she was asked, does nationalism have a bad name? Maybe should we use a different word? I can't remember the exact context. To which she went on a Hitler conversation. So the line of conversation she took was, Hitler, it would have been fine if they'd have just stuck to Germany and didn't invade Poland. Invading Poland and making everyone want to be German painted him as a globalist rather than a nationalist. And that was perceived by members of the Jewish community, quite rightly, in my opinion, that you can't just gloss over the Holocaust like that. The issue with Hitler wasn't that he invaded Poland. That was one of many issues. The bigger issue was the Holocaust, which she didn't mention. Now, I don't think that was what she was trying to say. I don't think she was trying to say Holocaust fine,
right,
invading Poland bad. I think she was trying to say Hitler bad, but she just did it in a terrible way. And she said she felt betrayed because she'd always stood by the Jewish community. And when organizations like the Anti-Defamation League started saying that you can't just say that, she became quite resentful. And that was maybe where things started to fall apart a little bit. And what really sent things spiraling was Kanye West. Now, Kanye West made a number of tweets and comments which got progressively worse and worse, probably culminating with the Alex Jones appearance, where he dressed up in a gimp suit or that was a weird outfit and went on a Hitler not so bad rant. But the first tweet that really sent Candace spiraling was, "I'm going DEFCON 3 on the Jewish people tomorrow." Something of that effect. I don't want to frame it. I've not got it in front of me. I'm going from memory. To which her response was, "Anyone who thinks this is anti-Semitic isn't being honest." I mean, it's pretty anti-Semitic to say in the morning you're going DEFCON 3 on the Jewish people, but by Candace's logic at that point, she was convinced that you can't be racist or you can't be anti-Semitic unless what you're saying is coherent. Now, I think many racists are incoherent. I've met many a bonehead who isn't that articulate with their prejudice. And so this then really starts the wheels of motion, and it gets progressively worse. And it got to the point where it's something like, when I did my analysis, which was a few months ago, it's probably got much worse by now, but around almost 2/3 of her videos mentioned Jews, and it wasn't in a positive light. And she started to paint a very elaborate conspiracy theory, which shifted the focus from Jews to Frankists or Zionists, and those two kind of came interchangeable. We can get really into the weeds and all of that, but I think what I would like to just step back and say one thing, which is really important. When it comes to anti-Semitism, it often takes on a different mask. And so in each generation, anti-Semitism manifests in different ways. So in Christendom, I'm on a Christian channel here, I believe, it was that what was the worst thing that anybody could possibly do? Deicide. What was the worst thing that you could do is to kill God. So what did the Jews do? The Jews killed Christ. And that formed the foundation of horrendous anti-Semitism from the Christian community for centuries. Today, the Christian community is our closest friend. If you'd have told my ancestors 500 years ago that today the closest friends of the Jewish people in the world are the Christians, they would look at you like you're insane. And we've got the Jewish community has a huge debt of gratitude to Anglo-Protestants of all people, because that's where a lot of the bridge building occurred. I actually believe Jews are in Israel today because of work that 17th century Christian preachers did in the UK. And in Islam, the worst thing you could do was insult the prophets. What did the Jews do? They insulted the prophets. They killed the prophets. In communism, what was the worst thing you could be? The bourgeois class. You're a capitalist. What were the Jews? The capitalists. In Nazi Germany, what were the Jews? The Jews were the communists, or the untermenschen, the subhumans. But in every anti-Semitism changes, and what's more telling is what are they saying. And so when we delve into what Candace Owens says about the Frankists, the word Jew and Frankist becomes interchangeable, and the people that she's looking at are overwhelmingly Jewish people. And it's the same with Zionists. So when people tell you that the Jews control the media, and then they scratch it, no, the Jews don't control the media, the Zionists control the media. And then you ask them to point out some of the Zionists and they all have Jewish surnames. It becomes very telling. So there's some really interesting stuff when we get into the Frankist conspiracy that Candace has stumbled upon. But in my opinion, it is anti-Semitic. And I'm not sure if she's aware or not aware. I don't know what's in someone's heart. Like, I do think she like, the journey is phenomenal how she arrived there. So
in other words, you would posit that somebody can promote anti-Semitism without necessarily intending to be an anti-Semite?
Absolutely. And in fact, I do a lot of work with the Muslim community, like huge amount of work. And one of the most common things I encounter is Muslims tripping over themselves to show how Jews and Muslims have great relations for all time. It's not true, but that's what they believe. And they will go out of their way to portray their prophet as being a friend of the Jewish community. But then they'll slip into hardcore anti-Semitism, but just use the word Zionism. So the Zionists control the banks, the Zionists control the movies, the Zionists control the weather. And when you delve into that, it's Israelis. And when you delve into that, it's not Israeli Arabs, it's Israeli Jews, or it's Jews outside of Israel that support the state of Israel. And so, yes, I do believe you can be anti-Semitic and without that being your intention.
But would you say that being anti-Zionism is automatically anti-Semite in nature?
Yes, but that's another hour-long podcast. But very, very briefly, there isn't a word that describes opposition to the existence of any other state than the Jewish state. There is only one Jewish country in the world, and if you are opposed to its existence, which is what anti-Zionism means, then you are, in my opinion, by default, an anti-Semite. Now, that's not to say that you have a hatred of the Jews, but if you're objecting to the Jews have a nation, but you don't object to the Italians or any other people, then it becomes very problematic. Now, being a Zionist doesn't mean you're anti-Palestinian. You can support the existence of a Jewish state, Israel, and you can support the creation of a future Palestinian state. The two aren't mutually exclusive. And so, yeah, that will be I believe that you can't be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic, but I believe many anti-Zionists aren't aware of that prejudice and believe in their heart they are pro-Jewish and anti-Semitic.
Yeah, like you said, there's a whole show there. There's a lot that we could explore on that one. Let me also ask you this: do you think that sometimes the anti-Semite card has been thrown down in a way that wasn't fair? You know, sometimes people are labeled anti-Semites when they're not.
I think Candace Owens in the early days, and I think Candace Owens, she basically, after the Jesse Smollett thing, which she was very critical of a racial hoax within her, from her community, she started seeing that within the Jewish community, and she saw Jews and non-Jews accusing people of anti-Semitism where she believed that they weren't. And in some of those cases, I agree with her. There was an instance where Jamie Foxx, I think he tweeted, oh gosh, I got to remember this because it's well done the research, but something to the effect of Judas hashtag fake friends. They killed Jesus. Okay. Hashtag Judas, hashtag fake friends. Now, as a Jewish person, you read it, they killed Jesus, you're like, oh, here we go again. And so the Jewish community was instantly, Jamie Foxx, you're an anti-Semite. And that's because you tend to put yourself at the center of most stories because you see the world through your own eyes. And he was like, hold up a minute, guys, that's not what I meant. I've got some fake friends, and Judas betrayed Jesus. So fake friends killed Jesus. I was saying fake friends. I wasn't talking about Jews killing Jesus. I was talking about fake. And so I think that was an instance of where he probably wasn't being anti-Semitic. And after the Holocaust is in living memory, every Jew I know has been the victim of anti-Semitism. And maybe you see it where it isn't. And I think that was an instance of where it wasn't. Candace Owens spoke out against that, and I actually agreed with her analysis on that. That was an instance where someone, I believe, was wrongly accused of anti-Semitism. The same with when she was accused of being an anti-Semite, when she tried to attack Hitler's nationalism and ended up almost whitewashing the Holocaust by accident.
Yeah, I did not take her comments to be anti-Semitic in nature. I think that she poorly expressed herself, but I didn't perceive anything in there that was intentionally anti-Semitic in nature. But it seems like we have the same opinion there. So, okay. She does, however, have, at least at this point, kind of a history of defending people who have been accused of anti-Semitism. Do you think that some of those people, in addition to Kanye West, or other than Kanye West, some of those people that she is defending are actually anti-Semites?
Nick Fuentes, possibly an anti-Semite. I'm just going to put it out there. Maybe they're the guy who rants about Talmudic Jews, doesn't like the Jewish people. So he got into an online spat with Jordan Peterson, where Jordan Peterson was commenting on Biden's mental health and asked, so who's been running the White House, or something of that nature? Nick Fuentes responds underneath, Jews, full stop, of which Jordan Peterson and his daughter rightfully go after Nick Fuentes. And Candace mounts this weird defense of Nick Fuentes, where she links to a Times of Israel article where it mentions Jews being disproportionately, or no, it doesn't say disproportionate. It says a number of Jews that are represented or potentially represented in the new Biden administration. I think I did the math on it. It was between 15 and 20% of the senior, senior administration. So you're talking maybe 60 to 80 people were of Jewish descent. Now, that is an overrepresentation, but overrepresentation is not the same as control. And the majority were Christians. That doesn't mean that Christians control the White House. It means that unless they're all colluding and it's a cabal of Christians who are pulling strings and for the advancement of Christian interests, which is not the case in America.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not the case with the Jews. Overrepresentation or slight overrepresentation of a community does not suggest there's some sort of control or a cabal. And it's that inference, it's to suggest that there is where you lean into anti-Semitism. So Nick Fuentes was being anti-Semitic by saying Jews control, they don't. And Candace Owens then mounted a defense of Nick Fuentes, bizarrely claiming that Jews actually were overrepresented. Look at all these Jews that the Times of Israel is boasting is in the administration. And so I think that's an example of where she just defends a flat out vile anti-Semite.
I don't know if you've seen it. I think they've maybe had a fallout since some of those comments.
Yeah, that would not surprise me. But I think with Candace Owens, I don't think she's a Nick Fuentes. Nick Fuentes hates Jews. He has it in for Jews. I think Candace Owens has tied herself in knots because she's got into a spat with the ADL. She believes she was fed to the ADL, and that's where we get into some crazy conspiracy theories in a minute. But yeah, she believes she was fed to the ADL, and she objects to certain Jews, and she sees Jews everywhere. She has confirmation bias wherever she looks. Like, I'm a Jew. There's 630 mitzvot that we're supposed to follow. I can't tell you how many times I see the number 613. I go to the supermarket. Something is 6 shekels and 13 cents. Sure. I look at the time. It's 6:13, and I say, and you might like, oh, it's a reminder. I should be doing mitzvot. I should be doing this, because you have this confirmation bias, and sure. So she has this confirmation bias. She sees Jews everywhere. And so she believes that Michael Jackson was controlled by a cabal of Jews. She believes that Kanye was controlled by a cabal of Jews. She believes all of Hollywood is controlled by the what she calls a Jewish gang. And so she's got she's not coming from a place of hate, but she's got herself, in my opinion, in quite deep water.
The way she sees herself is that she's not an anti-Semite. She loves, all sorts of Jewish people who are her friends and things like that. She's just criticizing some Jewish people. What would you say, to that?
So I would say I believe that's what she believes. But as we get into the conspiracy theories and we begin to take them apart, there's no difference between what she's saying and a David Duke or any out-and-out anti-Semite is saying. And it's this obsessive interest in this one group. Jews are a tiny percentage of the global population, but she obsesses over us. To the extent now where I'd imagine it's got to the point where I'd have to do the analysis, but I'd imagine 3/4 of videos now talk at some point about Jews. And so when you're that obsessively talking about the Jewish community and you're not talking about them in a positive light, you're talking about them in a negative light, I think it's hard to defend. It becomes increasingly more obvious that there's something going on there, even if she isn't aware of it, which I don't believe. I think when she says she loves Jews, her best friends are Jews, I have no reason to doubt that. But she's peddling to millions of people. She has over 20 million followers, hardcore anti-Semitic theory. She may isolate it to a small group of Jews or Frankists, but the outcome is the same. The outcome is anti-Semitism on a huge scale.
The impression I get from her is that the reason why she seems to have this preoccupation with Jews, as you say, this is kind of numerically something that's really insignificant. But I think the reason why she has such a preoccupation with a small amount of people is she feels like they're overrepresented in the media and that there's a lot of Jewish people who control different media outlets. What do you think about that?
I think to say that Jews are overrepresented is not problematic in the slightest. It's a statement of fact. We're overrepresented in Nobel Prizes. We're overrepresented in various fields. There's historical explanations for why that may be. And actually with the Frankists, it becomes very, very, because the success of the descendants of the Frankists is actually phenomenal. But when you look at which families the Frankists came from, it makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. And so there's usually good explanations for why there is overrepresentation. But to say that isn't problematic, it's what you do with that information. So if you're obsessively talking about Jewish overrepresentation in a negative way, that's when, as Jews, our anti-Semitism radar starts tingling, and we start paying attention.
I gotcha. You mentioned the ADL there. She does seem to have a lot of a focus on the ADL. What is her perspective there, and why is she so preoccupied with it in your estimation?
Okay, I think maybe if we have to get into the conspiracy theory now,
sure.
to explain that.
Sure.
So we can get to that to begin with. Before we get to the conspiracy, just to outline what happened. Candace was accused of anti-Semitism by the ADL, and she is a fighter. If you come at Candace, she's going to come swinging back. And so she came swinging back, and she has been swinging back now for well over a year. Actually, for several years now. And she began to develop one of the most insane conspiracy theories in the world, which all revolves around the ADL. And it's phenomenal where it's taken her. Mm-hmm. So where's a good place to start? So we'll start with Freud, Sigmund Freud. Mm-hmm. There's a connection there.
Yeah, she's been talking a lot about Freud.
Yeah, and so cards on the table. I'm no expert on psychoanalysis. I only really started reading about it to research this subject. But Candace Owens, rightly or wrongly, can't comment, not an expert, sees a lot of the moral degeneracy, the moral decay of the West as being downstream of Freud. And so she starts reading books on Freud. And one of the books she reads is by a Jew called Jeffrey Masson.
Did she actually read it?
She hasn't read it. I have. She does. I think she may have read the next book I'm going to reference. So this is the painful thing about this research. I sat through. I watched for a week every episode of Candace Owens where she talks
over 72 hours, right?
That's a lot. Yes, 72 hours of Candace Owens. I felt like I knew her better than my own wife by the end of that period. And she talks about a number of books too, which I'm going to talk about now. Which she definitely hasn't read one, and I don't think she's read the other one either, but we'll get into them because it's all part of the journey. So the first one by Jeffrey Masson, she believes that in this book, Masson says effectively that Freud was a child abuser. Now, he says nothing of the sort in the book. What he does describe is how Freud moved away from, so there was a again, not qualified to speak on it, but I'm told a pseudo-medical illness called hysteria in women, when women were hysterical. Not qualified to comment on it, not going to say whether it's real or not, but Freud believed in it back then, and he was trying to find the cause of hysteria. And through talk therapy, he identified that many of the females that were coming to him spoke about how they'd been abused by their parents, by their father. And he begins to develop a theory, which he called the seduction hypothesis, that victims of child abuse develop hysteria, or hysterics were abused as children. He presents that theory to the psychoanalyst or the psychiatric community, and they reject it because he's effectively, it went against the morals of that day, is how Masson describes it, and how most describe it, is Freud's basically saying, and Freud had been working with all the children of the people he's presenting this to, that your children who are hysterical, well, they were abused by their fathers, you guys. And so it doesn't go down very well. There'd been previous people who'd made similar findings or made similar theories previously, and they'd also been rejected and ridiculed. And so Freud kind of abandons the theory and replaces it by saying, actually, it's not, I can't say that hysteria is caused by child abuse, because not everybody I've spoke to who is hysterical has been abused by children. Was abused as a child. So therefore, I'm going to say that these are the imaginations of the patient. They weren't abused. It's just a fantasy in their head. I'm not qualified to comment on it. It sounds crazy to me. And actually, one of the people in the book, which Mason mentions about, Sandor Ferenczi, takes the opposite and says, no, Freud, you were right the first time round. Child abuse leads to mental health problems, which we now know is a fact, amongst the victims of it as adults. And so in this book, this is where it gets crazy. There's three people that are mentioned. There's Wilhelm Fleiss, Sandor Ferenczi, and Emma Eckstein. Those names are important, but we're going to go to the next book she mentions before coming back to those names, because it gets crazy. And so she then recommends another book, which is by a Canadian Jew called David Buchan. And in this book, he says that Freud based all of his psychoanalysis on the Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. And for those that aren't aware, Jewish mysticism, the Kabbalah, is the hidden side of Judaism. Historically, you were only allowed to study the Kabbalah when you were 40 years old and married. And at least since the medieval period, the key text, the key Kabbalistic text, is a book called the Zohar. And almost all Orthodox Jews in some shape or form include the Zohar in their, it's not in the Bible, and it's not in the Talmud, it's post, but as part of their religious text that they work with. There is a minority that reject at least Lurianic Kabbalah, but this is, again, another deep podcast that we don't need to go into. But the basic premise is most Jews in some shape or form include the Kabbalah in their religious practice, in their prayers, in the ritual items that they'll use will have Kabbalistic influences on them. So it's completely mainstream. Now, Freud was completely secular. He was an atheist. He didn't learn the Kabbalah. He had no connection to the Kabbalah. But this David Buchan comes up with some wild theories as to why he believes that Freud is a Kabbalist and based psychoanalysis on the Kabbalah. My favorite example in it was Freud has to think, to keep the anonymity of one of his patients, he has to think of a name. And he has to think of a feminine name to describe, to call this patient without revealing who she is. What name pops into his head? Dora. Buchan looks at this and says, what does Dora rhyme with? Torah. Dora rhymes with Torah, therefore Freud must be a Kabbalist. And so, this is the level of the of scholarship. And that Buchan's a serious scholar as well, which is why it's even crazier when you read this. But she then develops this theory, because in the book, Buchan starts talking about the Frankists. Now, Jacob Frank was a false messiah. We've had a few of them in the Jewish tradition. He was one of the more wild ones. And so he was born, I think, 1726 maybe, and died 1791. So relatively recently. We've been around for 3,000 and something years. So he's modern for us. So one of a more modern heretic. And he basically belonged to a tradition called Sabbateanism, which were the followers of another false messiah 100 and so years earlier, Shabbatai Tzvi. Shabbatai Tzvi became, he presented himself, he believed he was the messiah. He had thousands and thousands and thousands of followers, and he got so big that he caught the attention of the Ottomans, and the Ottomans, I think Mehmed IV was like, dude, you're not the messiah. Either you convert to Islam or we kill you. And so Shabbatai Tzvi thinks, okay, I think I'm gonna keep my life and I'll become a Muslim. So he takes the Shahada, La ilaha illallah. We'll say Musa Rasulullah. Moses is the messenger of God. He said somebody else, and he becomes a Muslim. 300 of his followers convert to Islam, but the majority of his followers revert back to normative Judaism. but a few of them retain their false beliefs, and they believe he's still the Messiah, and they're like crypto Sabbateans. And so you have a small number of Jews and a small number of Muslims who are now following this false creed. And Jacob Frank, I don't know what his actual name is. Frank was a name he was given by the Ottomans, probably because he was born, was he born in Poland? I'm not sure where he was born, but he then moved into the Ottoman Empire and traveled to various parts of the Ottoman Empire to be with the Dunma, who were the Dunma were the 300, the descendants of the 300 who converted to Islam. And he now begins to take on messianic pretensions. And so this Jacob Frank goes back to Podolia, to Europe, and he presents himself as the Messiah, and he builds up a cult following. And they believe in some crazy stuff. So, for instance, they believe that redemption comes through performing the sins which are punishable by karet. Karet, so I don't know what it is in English, but it would be all the sins that relate to incest. It would be like eating leavened produce on Passover. So karet means cut off. So it means you are spiritually cut off from the Jewish people if you perform these sins. So if you have relations with your daughter, you are cut off from the Jewish people. It's a good thing. Jacob Frank had relations with his daughter, Eva. And so they practiced the most degenerate forms of heresy you can imagine. And so this crazy cult, they call themselves certainly, but we call them the Frankists now, but the followers of Jacob Frank start practicing all of these crazy stuff. I think one of my favorite rabbis, a rabbi called Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who actually says some very good. So within Judaism, how we approach different faiths is all determined by the Abrahamic faiths is determined by rabbis, because they all came after Moses and the rabbis of the Mishnah and the great assemblies, so like Ezra and the likes. And so we rely on our rabbis to interpret how should Jews relate to other faiths. And Rabbi Yaakov Emden is adamant that Christians are monotheists, whereas there are other Jewish rabbis who would take the Islamic stance that Christians aren't. So I think Emden is an incredible rabbi, and he goes to war with the Frankists. And he records in his work that they looked through someone looked through, hopefully I get this right, but looked through the window of a synagogue and saw all the Frankists dancing around a woman who was naked and supposed to represent the Torah. And so that's obviously like it would be the equivalent of the entire congregation of a church dancing around a naked woman. It would be the biggest scandal any church had experienced. And so the community's excommunicated. They're like, you guys are degenerate. And their belief is that they base most of their beliefs on the Zohar, but they don't. They butcher the Zohar. They butcher the Kabbalah. They throw out traditional Judaism, reject orthodoxy. And they're kind of the first Jewish Reformation after the Karaites to reject the yoke of the Mitzvah commandments, to reject the oral law, and so they're the original reformers. And they actually go on to influence the Reform movement. The descendants of Frankists were instrumental in developing Reform Judaism today. And so these Frankists are then cut off from Judaism, so some of them convert to Catholicism. There's a rabbi called Rabbi Elisha Shaw. His children, or sons at least, take on the new Polish name Wolofsky, and they actually so here to add to the conspiracy, you have a politician called Piotr Naimski who descends from a Wolofsky. You've got Jan Nowak. There are prominent people who descend from this Jewish Frankist family, which converted to Catholicism. And for around 3 generations, they continue to only marry Frankists. You can see it in all the family trees. The Wolofskis will marry the Simonetskis. They're all just intermarrying. But then around 3-4 generations, they stop and they just start marrying anybody. And it's because that's when there's huge assimilation throughout the Western world. Jews are abandoning Judaism, Christians are abandoning Christianity, and people leave the religions of their parents. And that happened to the Frankists as well. Now, this is where Candace steps in. And she comes up with this crazy theory that Sigmund Freud was a Frankist. Mm-hmm. And her proof for it, she says, look, if you don't believe me, Louis Brandeis, who was the first Supreme Judge in America that was of Jewish descent, Brandeis University is named after him. He was a Frankist. And he had a picture of Eva Frank on his desk. Now, I thought that's insane. I'm going to research that. I'm going to research, was Louis Brandeis a Frankist? And I don't think he was, but his parents and his wife's parents were unquestionably Frankist. There's no mention of him having a picture of Eva Frank on his desk like Candace Owens actually.
I couldn't find that picture.
So the picture doesn't exist. It's first mentioned in a book in 1979. Oh, what's the guy's name? Robert something. Maybe Robert Mann.
Said to exist, but there's no confirmation.
So he's the first person to mention that I can find in any of the archives I've looked through. So it's something that's first put out there in the late 70s, which is long after the period we're discussing. And so Louis Brandeis' parents were Frankists. They came from a prominent family in Prague. And in Prague, all the prominent Jewish families that were very wealthy, the overwhelming majority of them were Frankists. And the ordinary Jews in Prague weren't. And there was a huge schism between the two of them. Whereas in Poland, it tended not to be the noble families, but the ordinary Jews that followed Jacob Frank. And then they became nobles when they converted to Catholicism, because when a Jew converted to Catholicism, it was an incentive that you become a noble. And so not many of them, but some of them didn't. Actually, Jacob Frank oversaw the largest conversion of Jews to Catholicism of all time in 1759. I think it was around 1,500 of his followers. I think I've got those numbers right. Converted to Catholicism with him.
And she claims that those are fake conversions to infiltrate.
I think they were fake conversions in the sense that they only married other Frankists for a few generations, and you have some of them writing about their experiences and saying that they still kept up a degree of Frankism, but eventually it fizzles out, and they just either become full-on Christians, and there's many prominent Christian preachers that descend from Frankist families, or they become atheists, and there's many prominent atheists. Like an example would be Ben Elton, the author, descends from a Frankist family. They're very affluent families. I think the Wittgensteins, they descend from, or one of them descends from Frankists. And also, it only happens at some point. So you can have an affluent family, and then one will marry someone of Frankist descent, and then all their children descend from a Frankist, because that's how it kind of works. One of their ancestors was on the Frankist tree, even if they weren't practicing Frankism. And so Candace develops this theory, and she says Freud's a Frankist. And so I'm like, okay, she was right about Louis Brandeis. Let me have a look at Freud. And I was like, can't find anything on Freud. He's clean. At least there's no obvious Frankist in his family tree. But let's just check the other people that were mentioned in the book. Let's check his inner circle: Emma Eckstein, Wilhelm Fleiss, and Sandor Ferenczi. So Emma Eckstein, turns out she's like second cousin with Louis Brandeis. She's fully fledged descent from a Frankist family. I'm like, whoa, that's crazy. Candace kind of hit the nail on the head here. It's like she's blindfolded, playing golf in the dark with one arm, and somehow manages to hit a hole in one. So, okay, fine, that was a fluke. Let me check the next one. So I then check Wilhelm Fleiss. He's clean. Okay, let me just check his wife. His wife's married, like descends from from a Sabbatean family. She's married, like the most prominent Sabbatean family. She's married. Her first husband was descended from a Frankist family. So, well, that's crazy. He's clean, but like his wife's not so crazy. That's interesting. Okay, what about Sandor Ferenczi? Oh, he's not Ferenczi. He's actually Frankel. And he's also related to Louis Brandeis. So somehow, like Freud's inner circle all descend from Frankists, and it's like, what's going on? It's like, this is insane. And so I stop and I start thinking, okay, what's going on? And then it becomes very clear when you think about it. What had happened was these were the wealthiest families who were exposed to the best education, who were living in Prague, Vienna, this area, Bohemia, Podolia, and they and their ancestors, because they come from wealth, go on to do incredible things. It's not a coincidence that the great-great-great-great-grandson of one of the richest families in Prague is still wealthy today. World-renowned author like Ben Elton as an example. Because you're born into a family which has the tradition of education. You're born into a family which has money, which gives you a head start in life. And that is and you're also born into the Frankists were like the original hedonists. They were degenerates, they were heretics, but they were creative and original thinkers. And they got involved in a lot of social reformation movements because that's their tradition. Their tradition was they rejected the yoke of orthodoxy, and they then take that, the so-called free spirit, into whatever they then go on to do. And so it's not surprising that some of the more acclaimed Jewish scholars, intellectuals, and men of business in Vienna and Prague, which is the areas we're talking, descended from Frankist Jews. It wouldn't be the case if you went anywhere else, because it was only really in Prague where it was the elite that took on the religion. In most other places, it was the ordinary people. And then when you look at those that converted to Catholicism, it's unsurprising that their descendants go on to do well, because they're literally nobles. They are now nobles. It's Sir this, it's Lord that. And so they also go on to do incredible things because they are now men of money. And not all of us are born with that silver spoon. And so this is where her conspiracy just all comes together, because the ADL was founded after a man called Leo Frank was lynched for effectively what happened was he owned a factory. He was the manager of a factory, and a young Catholic girl was murdered there. Today, most people believe it wasn't by Jacob Frank who was found guilty of the murder. He was found guilty of the murder of this girl, but then after new evidence emerged, that sentence was commuted. And when it was commuted, a lynch mob a few months later broke into the prison and lynched this Jewish man. And this divided the Jewish community and the Atlanta community, or not the Atlanta community, but many from Atlanta, with the Jews saying this was a modern day blood libel and they're lynching Jews for murders they didn't do. And the ADL was formed in response to that. And because his surname was Frank, Candace Owens says he was a Frankist. Look, his surname's Frank. And he was actually carrying out a blood ritual, blood sacrifice on Passover, which is what the Frankists do. The Frankists do nothing of the sort. They involved in all sorts of degeneracy, but not ritual murder. They were more likely to sleep with their sister than they were not more likely. They would sleep with their sister, but they wouldn't go around killing people. There's no scholars that I've come across while researching this that would suggest what Candace is. And so what Candace does, she takes a lot of shots in the dark. And so with the conspiracy that Freud was a Frankist, it was literally like she was blindfolded playing golf, and she hit 3 hole-in-ones. It was phenomenal. But then when she comes to the ADL stuff, it all starts just falling apart, and you just see that she's clutching at straws. She was clutching at straws with Freud as a Frankist based on what this author Bakan was saying. And then Jacob Frank, Leo Frank is obviously a Frankist because his surname is Frank. And so it all comes together for her. So now the ADL is this Frankist organization that's been created to protect Frankist ritual murder. And that's their sole purpose. And that's why they're going after her, because she's onto the Frankists. And then she starts pointing out these Jewish gangs in Hollywood, and these are all Frankists. But when you ask how, what's your evidence? It all comes back to surnames, Jewish surnames, Jewish sounding surnames. Frank is as common as Smith amongst the Jewish people. Jacob Frank's surname wasn't Frank. He was given the name Frank when he went to the Ottomans. They called him Frank because they assumed him to be, or they just lumbered him in with a Frank, a German, a person of Europe. He wasn't an Ottoman. And then he took that name back to Europe. And there are many, many Franks and Frankels in the Jewish community. And the overwhelming majority of them have nothing, in fact, I'd imagine all of them have nothing to do with the Frankist movement. Most of the Frankists had names that didn't include the word Frank in it. And so I think that's the entire conspiracy. I probably missed out a lot. We can get into it. But her evidence is based purely on surnames. And it's the same with the Zionists. When they talk about the Zionists controlling the banking, like, okay, so who? Oh, it's Cohen, it's Goldberg, it's Rubenstein. All the people with Jewish-sounding surnames. Oh, they're Zionists now, even if they're anti-Zionist. Like Soros is an anti-Zionist, but when they talk about the Zionist conspiracy, he's always lumbered in there. And so Zionist, Frankist, these terms just become interchangeable with the word Jew, when the conspiracy theories that you're advocating are the exact same. Blood ritual, controlling the banks, controlling. These are the age-old anti-Semitic tropes that my people have been persecuted for after being accused of performing.
So you would say that's the main basis for why she posits that Frankists control the media, because they have Jewish-sounding names, and
so it's the only evidence. There's when you study the actual Frankist families and you go into the genealogy, you can see that they just begin marrying out. It's so apparent they're all marrying each other, and then they just stop around 3 or 4 generations. Each one's a different time, but they assimilate. Like my ancestors assimilated. They stopped being religious. I'm the only religious person in my family. Most of my family are Marxists, and it was the story of most Jews at the beginning of the 20th century in the West. They abandoned their religion, and the Frankists were no different. They also abandon religion and start marrying out. Some of them take on the Christian faith. Some of them have converted previously, abandoned the Christian faith, but they ceased to be Frankists. The Frankists ceased. They were definitely a thing, and they write about it. So, for instance, Louis Brandeis's wife, her grandfather, Wilhelm Gottlieb, he writes in his will that they are the followers of Jacob Frank, and he's proud of this fact. But the Frankists ceased to exist because their religion was a nothing religion. They were following a false messiah. The false messiah dies. The inheritor of that title, his daughter, also dies, and the religion just fizzles out. It says the scholarly, she quotes people like Gershom Scholem. Gershom Scholem says this Frankist school completely died out. The cult died. All of the consensus is it doesn't exist anymore. But Candace Owens is adamant it does exist because she needs somebody to blame for when she talks about. She can't talk about Jewish gangs. She can't talk about Jews controlling her. She needs it to be something else, and so she pins it on a cult which died out over 100 years ago, and had already largely completely died out after the death of the 2 Franks.
Yeah, the way it sounds is she'll say, Kanye West and other people who allegedly have inside information know that the media and Hollywood and the rap industry is controlled by PDF files. And she'll say these PDF files happen to also be Jewish people. And you have this cult of Frankists who were Jews who practice this. Ergo, these are all Frankists who are controlling the media. It seems to be that's kind of the way that she connects the dots, and really they infiltrated not just the Jewish faith, they also infiltrated Catholicism and Islam and all of the Abrahamic faiths.
So I think the onus is then just to huge claims require huge evidence.
Yeah.
So if you're making the outlandish claim that there's a cabal of Jews and Catholics who actually I've missed out one vital part. She traces these back to the Canaanites. She believes that they're actually the Canaanites, which is even more crazy. It's like the Canaanites disappear; they don't exist. There's a few graves north of me in the Levant and south of me in Ashkelon. I'm in Israel at the moment, but outside of the graves, the Canaanites don't exist anymore. but she believes that they do, and they infiltrated Judaism and they infiltrated all of this. And so it gets very confusing. So she'll use things like, imagine if there were families that can trace their lineage back to the Bible. And you're like, she's talking about Jews. And I thought she was talking about Jews. But then you listen on, you listen to more of her podcast, and you realize she's actually talking about Canaanites who are mentioned in the Bible. But there's nothing there. It's all her imagination. She's got an incredibly vivid imagination, but no evidence. If you're making the claim that Canaanites infiltrated all the major religions and have continued to do so for 3,000 and something years, you need to present some evidence. You can't take one 18th century Jewish cult that were absolutely degenerate, absolutely heretical, and say because they existed and they did this practice, this degeneracy, this cult goes all the way back to ancient Israel.
Yeah.
And
it seems like some people feel like this notion of Frankism is just kind of a mask to target Jews. Do you think that that's fair, or would you say no, that's probably not a very charitable interpretation?
If I was trying to be as charitable as I could, and I really shouldn't with Candace, she causes my people a lot of pain, but I do think she's a person who wields huge influence, and I would like to be charitable if I can, and I think she sincerely believes in her conspiracy theory, and she believes there is this cabal of Jews and their non-Jewish, I guess, brothers, sisters, I don't know, conspirators, who she needs to label them as something, and the Frankist label is very convenient, but there's no evidence to support what she's saying, and she must know that. She must know that there's absolutely nothing.
I don't know if she knows that. She really believes that the moon landing didn't happen. And she has questioned whether or not the Earth is round, and has said that there's really no way to determine whether it's round or flat. I just can't know. So she's agnostic about it. So I'm not convinced that she knows better. I'm sorry. I've seen too many wild things from her. She thinks in her mind there is no such thing as a conspiracy theory. That was just something that the CIA brainwashed you to believe. And so she just, I don't know if she has the ability to.
Hers is a literal conspiracy theory. There is a conspiracy amongst the cabal of Frankists that are controlling the world. It's like the definition of a conspiracy theory. Now, she might be right, and I might be wrong.
I don't know if she has the tools necessary to discern through these,
I've seen a lot of the content. I actually think she's intelligent, and I think she's intelligent. And what she's doing is she knows what's going to create a sensation and get her lots of views. And I think her audience, a huge section of her audience, believe the nonsense that she says. And I think it's in this Frankist case, it's actually convenient for her because she is at war with major Jewish institutions. She is attacking the Jewish community. And I don't think she considers herself an anti-Semite. So if she can scapegoat and blame it on this small Frankist, look, it's not the Jews I have a problem with. It's this cabal of Frankist Jews, and there's Catholics as well in there. It's very convenient. It provides cover for her views and legitimacy. Like nobody wants to be tired a racist or an anti-Semite. And so it's a very convenient conspiracy theory for her to believe in. So I think she probably does believe it, but she also knows that it's based on nothing other than like a few surnames and Freud, which like is just crazy in itself. Somehow Freud is in the heart of this conspiracy theory. But if I was to be charitable, I think she believes what she's saying, but she knows she's saying it without any evidence.
It's hard to pin her down. I don't know. It seems that it's getting weirder and weirder and weirder as the months go by, and to adopt this position that there are no conspiracy theories, that conspiracy theories is something created by the CIA. So at that point, it's just like there's really no guardrails here for her. She's just gonna, I don't know if she's gonna end up in solipsism, you know, the philosophical view that you're the only one that actually exists and everyone else is just a figment of your imagination. I feel like this kind of radical skepticism, that's where it's going to lead her.
I wasn't aware of that, but it's my reading after after this podcast. But if conspiracy theories aren't real, like what does that mean? Like what she said? I haven't been listening to her recently. I made my video.
She thinks that there aren't conspiracy theories, that the term and concept conspiracy theory was created by the CIA with the Charles Manson affair, and that was their way to brainwash people as a psyop. And so she believes that all the things that we're being told are conspiracy theories is actually reality, and it's just what the media doesn't want you to believe. So, you know, the existence in dinosaurs, or that we landed on the moon, you know, for people to say, oh, it's a conspiracy theory to deny the existence of dinosaurs, or that we landed on the moon. She says, no, there's no such thing as conspiracy theories. That's what the government wants you to believe. That's what the media wants you to believe, but you need to dig deeper. And it's wild. It's an
really
incredibly radical disposition of skepticism that I think, if consistently carried out, will lead to madness.
Which is what was really, really interesting with that is it's almost like she's at war with the Enlightenment. And what's very interesting about like this post-truth type worldview is when she was speaking to, I think, Tristan and Andrew Tate, I think both of them, or certainly one of them, she was describing how like she hates the Enlightenment, and the Dark Ages were actually the best ages because the people were theists. They followed religion. They had good morals, and so it's very interesting that like philosophically she's almost at war with the Enlightenment. But what's also interesting is you said that she doesn't believe in conspiracy theories. Yeah, I listened to her talk on her podcast about cabal and how the word cabal comes from Kabbalah, and so like whether she believes the CIA invented the term, she certainly is aware that for a long period of time, there have been people that have advocated that there is a conspiracy of people that are pulling strings. And so like she buys into that. So it's really fascinating that she like doesn't think it's real. Yep. Talks about historical examples of it on her podcast.
Yeah. I don't know if there's any guardrails here, so I'm a little concerned about the trajectory at this point. I don't know where this is going to end up taking her, and so I'm very concerned not only for herself, but more importantly for the millions of people that she influences with this kind of thinking. It really just seems like she's pouring gasoline on a lot of fear mongering and conspiracy theories. Anyways, well, we're wrapping it up here. Parting words, final thoughts, anything else that you wanted to sneak in there that we didn't get a chance to touch on?
I think we've extensively covered Candace Owens without switching the subject and talking about her thoughts on Israel, which would be another hour. I think we've covered everything. But I think that the best remedy for people like Candace Owens is talking about them. I decided I wasn't just going to flat out reject what she was saying. I would actually spend a huge amount of time researching each and every point she made to see if there was any truth in it. And if there was truth, I'd be honest and I'd share it with my audience, which is what I did with the whole Freud's inner circle descending from Frankists. That blew my mind. And it would have been easier for me just to sit on that information and just call her a crackpot. But it's like, no, it's important to take their claims seriously, but utterly debunk them.
And that's what caught my attention with your video, is that you actually sat there and went through all the material and really investigated it. And so I thought, okay, this is pretty helpful because I don't know anybody who has actually done that before. It's a wild rabbit hole to go down, and so
and not what I'm in any hurry to climb back into. I've quickly removed myself from said hole, and I'm back on my usual.
Tell people where they can go to find out more about you.
Okay, if you're interested in my work, and truthfully, most of my work is not about Candace Owens. It's fighting for the Jewish people and our survival. It's about Israel. It's about campaigning against anti-Semitism. And you can find me on all major platforms under the Israel Advocacy Movement. My name is Joseph Cohen. I'm the founder of the organization. And yeah, it'd be great to see you commenting on some of the videos.
Well, thank you so much, Joseph, for coming on. This was very, very helpful. Really grateful for your time.
A pleasure to be here. Thank you for hosting me.
Everybody hit that like button and the subscribe button. See you later. God bless.